dealing with the elimination of violence against women in the EU from the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. Maybe I can just point out to the members that during this debate there will be no catch the eye procedure and no blue cards will be received, because it will just be an issue of going around the groups. The first speaker is the author of the question, Mrs. García Pérez, 5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, over 9 million women have been victims of gender violence in Europe. It's hard to quote that figure without feeling ashamed. It's hard to quote that figure without realizing that behind those numbers there are lives cut short, women who've been killed by sexism. Sexism kills. If you think you own a woman, if you think society is not equal, then you may end up acting in this way. And today, on the 25th of November, it is our responsibility and our obligation to speak out, to avoid silence, to enter into a commitment to work, to do what we can to combat the worst social scourge facing the world and Europe right now. We need to take on board our own responsibilities. We should leave aside slogans and act. Women cannot wait any longer. Every day we see in our media and on the television news how there are women who are killed just because they're women. Their lives are cut short, their children's lives are cut short. We should live in a more equal society. We need a more equal society. We need, therefore, to take on board these commitments. We need to assume our responsibility. And in that light, I have questions for the European Commission. It's not the first time that we've had such a debate in the plenary session of the European Parliament, and it is my hope that following today's discussion we will get a European Commission commitment to the work that needs to be done in the future. We want to know when the European Commission will publish a new strategy for equality between women and men. The Parliament gave its view on that and the content of the strategy. For us it is vital that policy on equality between women and men should prioritise combating gender-based violence. But there are other questions that I have, because the European institutions have taken some steps, for instance victim protection orders. That was a vital step. It was less than a year ago when Member States met the deadline, or came up against the deadline for transposition of that. When will the Commission carry out its evaluation of the European Protection Order and how its implementation has been working? We also feel that it is vital to ensure that there is legislation in place. It's not the first time, Ms. Jourová, that the European Parliament has called for this. We need support for organisations with programmes on awareness raising and so on, but that doesn't solve the problem. We need legislation, because legislation constitutes a commitment. Legislation means you have to comply with this. Member States have to comply with this so that we can combat gender-based violence. We've heard on many occasions that people have been saying that we're not in a position to be able to combat gender-based violence at present, but we're not going to show resignation on this. We gave the EU powers to combat the economic crisis. Why can't the EU be given the powers to combat gender-based violence and to strive for a fairer, more just society? So Council, Commission, Parliament, who work together to get those legislative powers, because we can't just carry on waiting and make statements of intention that then don't end up being turned into reality. We're talking about the lives of women, the lives of half the population of Europe. They deserve our respect. They deserve our consideration and our action, much more action than hitherto. This should involve all of us, women and men, all institutions at all levels. We need it now. We need to unite our efforts because women deserve that. And in memory of those who were killed by sexist terrorists, we should do this. They deserve it too. It's not only about our generation, our daughter's generation too deserves this. It is our duty and obligation to do that.
Muchas gracias. En el nombre de la Comisión ahora tiene la palabra.
Thank you. For the Commission now, Ms. Jourová.
Honourable members, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for raising this very important and serious subject on the occasion of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It is an important political signal that both the European Parliament and the European Commission decided to join the UN Women Orange Day campaign to mark the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and to light up their buildings in orange today. Violence against women remains a challenge in every country in Europe. Still, in 2015, women are beaten, humiliated, raped, mutilated, stalked, harassed and forced into marriage. Violence happens in their homes, at the hands of their partners or family members. It happens in the workplace or in education, from colleagues, fellow students, professors or bosses. It can happen on the streets or online, from strangers. We know that 1 in 3 women in the EU has experienced physical or sexual violence, or both. Violence has a lifelong impact on the health and well-being of victims, as well as on their families. This, in turn, has an impact on the economy and society as a whole. Promoting gender equality and combating violence against women go hand in hand. Women need to be empowered to leave abusive relationships and to challenge violence when they encounter it. They should not be hampered in fulfilling their potential in the workplace and in society. I will present in December a detailed Commission plan and commitment on improving gender equality in the years to come. So I am prepared to submit also to the FEMM Committee the proposal for the gender strategic document for the years 2016 to 2019. We have worked on this with all stakeholders throughout this year, and also your input in the process was very valuable. Among the priorities, it will include further measures to support Member States in preventing and combating all forms of gender-based violence. Regarding gender-based violence, the Commission is taking a determined and comprehensive approach based on legislation, awareness raising and funding, as well as improving knowledge and data collection. I will start by focusing on legislation. The EU adopted legislation to prevent violence against women and to protect and support its victims, including in areas such as sexual harassment, trafficking in human beings, sexual abuse and sexual exploitation of children and child pornography. Our modern victims' rights of the Victims Directive, on which we have worked closely with you, just entered into force on the 16th of November this year. It will have a huge impact on some Member States, for instance those who will have to establish victims' support structures, which are of key importance for gender-based violence and which do not exist in all Member States yet. You can count on my commitment that the Commission will be guiding and monitoring the effective implementation of this piece of legislation, as well as the broader legal framework. We have to ensure that available protection measures are actually granted to persons at risk and applied in practice. Since January 2015, victims of domestic violence benefit from reinforced protection when travelling or moving to other EU countries. Protection orders granted in their home country can circulate across the EU borders. The transposition situation is encouraging. Thanks to enforcement procedures initiated by the Commission, we have now national rules transposing the European Protection Orders Directive in 21 member states. I am glad to inform you also that on 9 October the Commission has published a roadmap on a future accession of the EU to the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention. The roadmap is a first concrete step towards accession to this powerful tool to combat violence against women and domestic violence. EU accession to the Convention would reflect our commitment to combating human rights violations and discrimination both within and beyond the EU. The Commission also supports awareness raising and concrete grassroots actions by Member States, civil society organisations and European networks. This year, €8 million were allocated to combating violence against women under the Rights, Equality and Citizenship programme. We have also empowered advocates for change among female genital mutilation practising communities, trained services for victims of sexual violence in universities to better respond to incidents and young victims' needs, and supported Member States in sensitising the general public to this problem. I am proud to inform you about last week's decision to award 9 international projects combating violence against women linked to harmful practices with a total amount of €4.3 million. Within the framework of this awareness-raising work, I am also committed to putting into place focused actions on violence against women in 2017. We are currently planning future activities and would welcome your cooperation. I would also like to say a few words about the importance of improving our knowledge on the causes of gender-based violence on a regular basis. It is essential because it allows for monitoring of the situation across the EU and also helps us to formulate and implement better policies. My services are working with Eurostat and the European Institute for Gender Equality, two key actors in this area who, I believe, can help to fill the gaps. Finally, let me be clear that I see a need to address cyber violence against women and girls, an emerging form of violence. We have EU legislation and policies on children's, including girls' safety and protection from bullying, abuse and exploitation online. In addition, the Commission has launched a €3 million call for proposals to combat sexual harassment and sexual violence against women and girls, including through new technologies and social media. Proposals are now being assessed. Thank you.
Commissioner, thank you very much. We now come to the speakers on behalf of the groups. The European People's Party will start with Teresa JIMÉNEZ-BECERRIL Barrio for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Commissioner Jourová, for your commitment towards the victims. Now, today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and, why is it so vital for society to react here? It seems to me that we need to push forward all resolute measures which will put an end to this scourge. We can't accept getting used to this. Now, the fact of the hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil is just not acceptable here. And so there's a silence that has surrounded this issue. And people continue to be abused. And in the worst possible cases, it's the woman is killed by the person who claims to love her. Now, it's very important that the victims are able to bring charges against the perpetrators, but they need protection to be able to do that. So we need to have proper European victim protection arrangements made. And we need this to be recognised in European countries. We need women to be able to feel safe from their aggressors. And welcome this oral question to determine the precise nature of the European commitment proposal being made by the Commission. We're talking here about human rights abuses. We need to have, there's a calculation that 35% of women and girls suffer from some type of physical or sexual violence and abuse in the course of their lifetimes. And I believe that if we work on education and prevention and protection of the victims, and we will be able to improve the situation, do something about the damage sustained by the victims. And obviously, we insist that minors, children, are included in these arrangements. Thank you.
Next speaker for 3 minutes on behalf of the Socialists and Democrats, Maria Arena.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Commissioner. I don't want to go through the figures again. They've already been mentioned. 1 in 3 women in Europe is a victim of violence. Behind those numbers, there are human beings. Our daughters, our sisters, your wives, gentlemen, our colleagues, people, the people around us. 1 in 3 women. Look around the room. So the person to my left, the person to my right, has been or could be the victim of violence. Should we talk about the forms of violence? We know what forms this violence can take: physical, economic, sexual, psychological, and the most extreme form being women being killed. As Iratxe said, 7 women are killed every day just because they're women. There's female genital mutilation, human trafficking, sexual exploitation. Enough is enough. Sitting back and letting such discrimination happen is just not acceptable. Commissioner, Article 8 of the Lisbon Treaty says quite clearly that we need to ensure equality between women and men in Europe. You are a member of the European Commission, which is guardian of the treaties. So we call on you to do something very simple. Implement the treaty. Not plans, not steps. What we call for is for you to implement the treaty. Sometimes it's easier to defend the right of property than it is to defend the right to life. We call on you to defend the right to life for everyone, including 50% of the European population.
Merci beaucoup. Nächste Rednerin.
Thank you very much. Next speaker for 1 minute on behalf of the European Conservatives and Reformist Group, Ms. von STORCH.
Yes, President. Since 2004, the Parliament has regularly debated the issue of violence against women, and we've had the CEDAW programme of the UN, the Convention for the Elimination against all forms of discrimination against women. There's an EU programme to implement that UN Convention. But we still have violence against women. Are we not all against violence? Particularly violence perpetrated against the weak by the strong? Certainly we are. But it seems to me that sometimes the UN and others hide behind words. You know, words frame politics and policies, and sometimes they hide them too. It seems to me that we can't accept violence against men or boys either, but under the UN definition, we're looking at violence against women when they are unable to abort because it is illegal. And so you talk about then that woman being a victim of violence. Now, whatever your position on abortion, I think we ought to be quite open in our definitions. Thank you.
Thank you for the Liberal Group for 3 minutes, Guy Verhofstadt.
Yeah, dear colleagues, violence against women is not only a women's issue. gender violence is also a men's issue, and above all, it is a sad and a shameful reality, as have already been indicated in different interventions. At one point in their life, 1 in 3 women and girls experience physical or sexual violence from men, and most shockingly, almost half of this violence is committed by the partner of the victim, causing 2,500 deaths every year in the EU. That is 7 women each day losing their lives because of sexual assault, domestic violence, relationship abuse and female genital mutilation. So for too long, let's recognize that men have avoided the issue of violence against women and often cast it aside as just, oh, it's a women's issue. And I think that's the problem. That's the problem. As long as gender violence is seen as a women's issue, men disconnect, and we, men, must break the violence. Impunity for committing violence against women should be something from the past, and justice needs to prevail for all those women who are victims. And for that, I think, Mr. Commissioner, we need a EU-wide strategy to combat violence against women. Many EU countries effectively have laws today protecting women against such violence, but there are also many others who don't have and who could do much better. And the Istanbul Convention, initiated by the Council of Europe, obliges in fact countries to fully address violence against women in all its forms, to prevent it, to protect the victims, to prosecute the perpetrators. But so far, the reality is that the Istanbul Convention has only been ratified by 12 member states of the Union. And that's why I think we need to do something special, that is the EU accession. The accession of the whole European Union to the Istanbul Convention, so to close the loopholes in European and national legislation, and so to protect far better women, and certainly condemn countries with blood on their hands. So zero tolerance in the fight against gender violence is in fact the only way to address it. And we, not only women, but men and women, must unite and speak out. And that means break the silence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Korwin-Mikke, I announced at the beginning of the session there would not be blue cards because this is a round for the groups only. Thank you. On behalf of the group of the European Left, Malin BJÖRK for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Våld mot kvinnor är...
Gender violence is a terror that goes on in silence. It takes over our lives. We live in a culture that actually accepts that male violence against women can carry on. It's a culture that keeps public personalities in the public eye and supports them, even though they have carried out all sorts of atrocities. Noah Désir, who murdered his girlfriend, Roman Polanski, Dominic Strauss-Kahn. I could list men from all our countries in that enumeration. We're here today because we have asked, this Parliament has demanded, that there be legislation with minimum levels to protect against violence against women. We're not going to leave this issue behind. We have to help the world's women, and to do that the Istanbul Convention must be ratified. There's a right to help specially trained police. There should be special training for judges for those who are exposed to this. Member states have to maintain action plans to combat gender-based violence. I also demand that people who work for women's refuges and women who are exposed to this sort of violence should get the support they need. They have specialist knowledge. They are co-fighters in this battle, and they should have access to feministic self-defense. That's a way of developing people's self-identity there. We have to stand up against the violence that affects our lives and fight against this culture of silence that vilifies women and gives men carte blanche, because that will just lead to more and more violence being committed against women. The lack of proposals from the Commission is tacit approval of this that's going on. We need to have proposals. We need to make sure that this is done, because otherwise it is unacceptable.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you. Now on behalf of the Green Group for 1.5 minutes, Jordi SEBASTIA.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. This morning we spent more than 3 hours on a priority debate on the Paris attacks and the terrible terrorist threats that we're faced with. Now we will have less than 1 hour to talk about the main cause of violent death in Europe.
Can I start again? Thank you. Esta mañana hemos dedicado más de 3...
This morning we spent more than 3 hours on a priority debate on the Paris attacks and the terrible terrorist threats that we're faced with. Now we're going to have less than 1 to talk about the main cause of violent death in Europe. Violence against women. This affects us every day with greater intensity than any terrorist threat. You've already heard the figures, but here are some more, because they're just so awful. 1 in 3 women in Europe have suffered some kind of violence. 1 in 4 has suffered sexual violence. When will Europe recognize that this is our main security problem? How are we going to tackle this? Some EU member states still have legislation that will hide, conceal, or connive in this violence. Commissioner, we call urgently for solutions, because women are dying every day. Women are being killed by people who think they own those women, to the extent that they think they can do away with their lives. And they have to run and try to find a safe haven of refuge. We should also be able to act against governments that are becoming accomplices to this murder by failing to act. We need to combat this profoundly sexist structure. Ms. Jourová, you seem to be resigned to this. You talk about EU powers, but as Maria Arena has said, the EU treaties say that you're a guardian of equality. This is a crime against equality. Gender-based violence is a crime against equality.
Por favor.
Act quickly, please.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the FDD Group for 1.5 minutes, Ms. Daniela AIUTO.
Thank you, President. Well, colleagues, today, on this very symbolic day, we take note of and we're very happy about this, that even in the states where the Istanbul Convention has been ratified, or in states such as Italy where there are laws against violence against women, we continue to see problems both in the application of the legislation and also the handing down of appropriate sentences. Often people found guilty get off far too lightly before the courts. Now let's not forget the victims. We know that thanks to reductions in sentences and alternative penalties being arranged, there is no fairness for the victims. We also want to see something other than the subjective judgment of an individual magistrate determining whether actions were tantamount to stalking. And when it comes to the preventive measures, in parallel to that, we must ensure that the sentencing policies are appropriate. It seems to me that often the perpetrators can return to their happy lives of that they enjoyed previously, far too soon, unlike their victims who continue to suffer for many, many years throughout their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. AIUTO. 1.5 minutes now for the ENF Group. Janice ATKINSON.
Has it occurred to this place to put its own house in order before lecturing others on how they should behave? I have been subjected to verbal abuse and near physical violence in the Brussels and Strasbourg parliaments. Firstly, in one of the meetings I attended as an MEP, one of my fellow British MEPs called me a stupid fucking woman. he was overheard by a number of other MEPs and also members of staff. Is that acceptable? Secondly, an MEP from the Green Left called a female colleague trash in another debate a few weeks ago. Is that acceptable? And thirdly, I've been stalked by a misogynistic journalist who works for an EU media outlet. He arrived to interview me drunk, holding a glass of wine at 10 o'clock in the morning. His second attempt was to doorstep me on leaving the plenary here. He's a big guy in terms of girth and actually height. He had clearly been drinking again. He had a large camera precariously held on his shoulder, and yet he pursued me at pace along the corridor outside here into a glass partition. If he had slipped, he could have crushed me. I'm told he has a hatred of women, particularly those that are successful, and my politics. Is this acceptable? Yes, it seems that abusing women from the centre-right is okay. If a man from this side of the House turned to one of your women and called you the things that we have to put up with in this place, there would be outrage. There would be sanctions imposed, a statement by the President. Do I have any support in here? Silence. That tells me everything I need to know.
Thank you very much.
Now, from the non-attached, 1 minute for Diane DODDS.
Thank you, Mr. President. In today's society, violence against women is taking ever more unacceptable forms. We have only to look at the impact of human trafficking and the impact that this has on the lives of millions of women who are being sold into a life of sexual exploitation and abuse. And while I accept Mr. Verhofstadt's point that this type of violence is not only directed towards women, on this International Violence Against Women's Day, I am bolstered by the strides made in my own constituency of Northern Ireland with the introduction of the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Bill. It is a great example of regional legislation which tackles this evil in society and should act as a precedent for other member states. I want to take this opportunity to also highlight the work of Women's Aid in Northern Ireland, a voluntary organisation addressing domestic and sexual abuse. By providing refuge accommodation to women and their children who have suffered mental, physical or sexual abuse within the home, this organisation has helped to rebuild lives through a range of programmes and support services. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, colleague. And we now return to the Commission again, to Commissioner Jourová.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this discussion. Yes, we all have to do more. Not only European Commission. At all levels, we must act. You mentioned here that the Commission is the guardian of the treaty, especially Article 8, which is the equality article. I am very much concerned about equality, and I want to bring effective actions using effective instruments. You call for new legislation. I said clearly that we are going to exceed the Istanbul Convention. Speaking about possible new directive on combating violence against women, I myself could not seriously speak about the new directive as something which will solve the problem quickly. Just look at the process of the preparation of the European legislation. I am not criticising it, but I mean that even if we find the legal basis for this, it would take several years to bring it into force in the Member States and to let this do its work. So I am honestly speaking now about other instruments. I am declaring here that there is a problem with the legal basis for the legislation because the violence against women, this is criminal wrongdoing. So this is up to the Member States to use their competencies in the criminal law. We can do and we must do what we can do. We will do it through the accession to Istanbul Convention, which gives us the competencies to act also on in legislative sphere. What I see as more efficient instruments is to invest the available funding into the efficient awareness raising, into campaigning, into the support of the grassroots organisation and civil society, and into the training of experts and of professionals who should help more the victims of violence. And speaking about other actors who the Commission is prepared to support, we must speak first of all about the Member States where we are supporting, but at the same time we are pushing them to enforce the legislation which must help the situation. We must speak openly about the society as such, because the violence against women in many Member States is happening with silent acceptance from the side of the society, as if it is something normal. In some Member States this is even silently accepted by the media. So this is the direction where we should also look and where we should try together to help the situation. Let's speak about local communities, which must not be blind and deaf. They must understand something is happening around them. Let's speak about the victims themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the recent statistics and research saying that only 15% of violence against women has been reported to the relevant authorities. Yes, the victims remain silent, and it is also because they do not trust enough the authorities that they will act to help them. So this is what the Victims Directive is about, that the victims should not fear to report and expect the efficient support from the side of the relevant authorities. And the last ones, and Mr. Verhofstadt mentioned this here, are the men themselves. Yes, they must also do something to improve the situation. I was in Sweden recently. They have very good programs focused especially on men who have their essential part in combating violence against women, because without their understanding that the situation must improve, we cannot change anything. So this is a complex issue. This requires a list of many measures done by many different actors on many levels. So let's do it, and I am committed to explain more in detail when speaking about the gender strategy in mid-December at the FEM committee, about the concrete plans we have in the Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. The debate on this item of the agenda is thereby closed. Which brings us to the next item on the agenda. The statement of Council and Commission concerning the outcome of the Valletta Summit on 11th and 12th of November 2015, and also in relation to the G20 Summit 15th and 16th of November this year. I first call the Council, Minister Schmidt.
Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much, President, in French. Honourable members, Valletta Summit on Migration has allowed us to give a very specific expression of the commitments of the European Union by beefing up our cooperation with our African partners at every level to try and address the deep causes of irregular migration and to deal with the facets of this, including illegal migration and trafficking of people. The political declaration really stands testimony to what we have achieved there, together with our African partners. I'd like to underline the high level of European and African countries attending this summit. Most were represented by heads of state or government, and this bears witness to the political significance that everybody in Europe and Africa ascribe to the challenges that we face at the moment. Now what we need to do is to make sure that these political commitments are translated into strong commitments, equally as strong in the action plan. I'd like to underscore the most novel aspects here. First of all, the pragmatic and operational nature of this text, hinging on a number of well-defined actions in each area. These actions are meant to help social and economic development and environmental development in a sustainable way. We agree